Good morning, everyone. As we are being admitted, I'm going to keep trying to admit people. It's going to take just a couple of minutes as we're coming in. Might just take a few. Admitting. I am so happy to see everybody this morning. I honestly, I see some people chatting at 10 o'clock at night in the application, which is amazing. I don't think I've been to a PD where I've seen so much chatting going on, which is just tells me we've got some phenomenal teachers here today. I am just more than pleased and excited to be working with all of you. Let's see, admit. So with that, I'll just keep admitting people, and I don't want to take up any time. I would like to introduce, and I'm going to pin just a second, Dr. Fred Emil Katz. Dr. Katz is a Jewish child survivor of the Holocaust and a sociologist. His parents and older brother were murdered in the Civil War extermination camp. He's had a career as a sociology professor, having taught at Texas Tech, the University of Missouri, Buffalo, and Tel Aviv University. Within sociology, he began in the subfield of medical sociology, but then began focusing on addressing the Auschwitz phenomenon and sociologically, and finally responding to the real possibility that our human species may be lurching towards extinction. In a way, his story of survivor is a story of survival guilt in action, having to justify one's survival by one's ongoing efforts. In his case, though, as a professional sociologist. And Dr. Katz wants us to watch his video. We're going to watch this one more time. I posted the video for you guys to see, but we're going to watch it here live. While we're watching the video, before Dr. Katz comes on to speak with us, and you watch it, please post your questions in the Q&A. We're going to have a long time for Q&A today for Dr. Katz, so I'd like you to post your questions. We're not going to unmute everyone. We are going to stick with, I'm going to ask Dr. Katz your questions and pose them and see if we can get them answered properly. So we're going to watch the video one more time here. Let me share my screen. And make sure I get myself. If you can't hear or you have any problems technically, please let me know. Sorry. All right. And
well, I was born in a rural village in South Germany called Oberlauringen, about 90 or so miles east of the city of Frankfurt. There were Jews in that community from the 1700s on. There was a continuing Jewish presence in that village. And when I came on the scene, I arrived in 1927. There were probably about 30 or so Jewish people, about 10 families in the community out of about 350 people. Most of the people in the village were farmers, and some were small tradespeople. In a sense, our religion pretty much defined our life in many ways. And yet, if you'd asked my father, "What are you?" he would say, "I'm German. I served in the German army. I'm German." And if pushed along, he would, of course, acknowledge that Judaism was part of his life, but the first reference point would be German. He was a well-respected businessman. He was a kosher butcher in a community that respected him in the early life. From the history I saw, was he was active in the synagogue, and he was but all this changed when the Nazis prohibited the kosher preparation of meat. There was his livelihood. He no longer had any livelihood. I don't know how he subsisted. He sometimes left and came back with bundles of food, how he came to it, but he was a destroyed person. there was a very fundamental transformation of life of Jews after Hitler came along in 1933, which happened to be my first year in school when I was 6 years old. The transformation was really amazing and shocking and unexpected for all of us, the Jews, because our relationship to the Christian community seemed to change drastically and unexpectedly. So after Hitler came to power in 1933, one night all our windows were smashed. This was early in the Hitler regime. So at that point, we didn't fathom how come this could have happened, but the atmosphere was changing. So my father went to the local police, because we had no police in the village. He had to go to the next little township. And at that point, the police recommended that he leave the village for a while and stay with his other family. And he did, and eventually came back. So this was the early stage of the Hitler regime where we could still rely on the police being on our side. That changed fundamentally in the late 30s. So in 1936, when I was in second, third grade, Jewish children were no longer allowed to attend public schools, and we had no substitute. So essentially I missed out on a couple of years of elementary school. But during my time in school, I do remember two things: being beaten up to and fro from going to school, and how my classmates sang the Horst Wessel song. The Horst Wessel song says, "When Jewish blood comes spurting from the knife, then things go really well." At that point, I stopped singing for 30 years. For 30 years. Whenever it came time to sing, I said, I don't know how to sing. So the memories of school were terror. I can only describe my sense of not just school, my life became increasingly beyond fearful, but terror. Now, the terror then wrapped itself around my whole notion of Christians. I didn't differentiate between Nazis and Christians. For me, I was terrified of Christians, all Christians. So my parents never succeeded in leaving, and they were ultimately murdered at the Sobibor extermination camp. So my story is that as things got much worse for the Jewish community, and anybody who could possibly leave did so, anybody who had relatives overseas and so on. Now, we only had a sister of my mother's and her family who lived in Dayton, and they were new refugees in America and didn't have the means to sponsor us, but they managed to sponsor my sister. So my sister was able to leave Germany in 1937, I believe it was. And Ludwig, being older, had left home on a youth movement to try to go to Palestine, of the Hachshara, the movement. Ludwig wanted to go to Israel, and there was a training program in the 1930s to train young Jewish kids to become farmers who would then settle the land in Palestine. And so these were established in several countries, Holland, Italy, I believe, and one of the Scandinavian countries. My brother was sent to Holland. Well, he didn't make it past Holland when the Germans invaded. He was then deported, ironically, to the same extermination camp as my parents were. So anyway, but the rest of us couldn't leave, except my mother found out about the Kindertransport, and she eventually got me onto the transport. And when she was outside the train, she was crying. And I thought, why is she crying? I had no conception that I wasn't going to see her again. There was only one thing in my head, in my mind, I must get away. I must get away. That was the only thing I could think of. My mother, father, nothing was, I couldn't even think about it. In a sense, this was a lifesaver emotionally, in that how else could I have handled that I was saying goodbye to my parents forever? So on the Kindertransport, overnight through Holland to I forgot the name of the place in England where we landed, in Dover.
Dover, yeah.
Dover, I think. And so we landed there, and we were sort of herded first into sort of a holding area in the Margate or Westgate in England, where we stayed for a week or two or so. And eventually some people came and picked themselves up a child. Nobody picked me up. Now, it so happened I was a very inward person. There were others who were more outgoing and more friendly, who were likely to be picked up. I wasn't. So anyway, eventually, after another stay of a week or so in London at some sort of a school, I ended up at Bunce Court School, which was a, quote, progressive boarding school, which by progressive it meant we studied no classics and no science. We learned how to grow potatoes and practical things and woodworking shop. And we did have classes in English. I didn't do well in school. I had, first of all, I had less elementary education than the other kids. And nobody had ever told me to study. So I didn't. So I did badly. And so I failed the examination that would pass you on to the pre-college. And so I had to leave at age 15. And from then on, for the next 6 years, well, legally I was transferred to London under, quote, the Jewish Board of Guardians, who housed me with a Jewish couple. But that wasn't sort of the end of it for me. That is sort of, for the next 6 years I worked in factories. And eventually ended up at Guildford College, who were flexible, let's say, for somebody who didn't have a high school diploma in the admission requirements. They were flexible. Also flexible financially. When I told them I had no money, they said, "We'll find a way." So somebody told the other day, my doctor says, "You're an overachiever." Well, yes, in a sense, I'm overachiever. I had no high school diploma. I had worked in factories. I ended up being a college professor at 4 universities in 3 countries and published 10 books. In a college professorship's career, being a full professor with lifetime tenure is it. You're set for life. I twice walked away from such a position without backup. And so the second one was from the first one was in State University of New York, where I was a full professor. I left it up in order to go to Israel. Well, while in Israel, 2 things happened. I never embraced Israel. I never learned about the country. I never wanted to travel. I had no curiosity. And the other thing that happened, I couldn't learn Hebrew. I knew prayer Hebrew to this day, but I couldn't learn spoken Hebrew. We went through the traditional immigration program, 3 months, I think it was, of an Ulpan, a residential program. The Israelis have a program of total immersion in Hebrew for immigrants. They have lots of immigrants and lots of demand, and it works. During that time, all your needs are taken care of. You're given housing, you're fed, uh, all your needs are taken care of. All you have to do is come to class and learn Hebrew. During the 3 months I think I was there and attended class, I never spoke. I never opened my mouth. Guess who didn't learn Hebrew? I simply froze and could not. Now to this day I can remember words and so on, but so I had already been appointed a full professor, so obviously I could teach in English as long as I wanted to, but after a while nobody needed to tell me, it's about time you taught in Hebrew. Well, it became an impossible situation for me, and that was one of the reasons why we went back to America. During that stage, I was still in denial about Judaism and being a survivor. I read nothing about the Holocaust at that time, and I claimed in college that as a professor, I was saying the Holocaust is not interesting from somebody whose parents were murdered. I said that. Then the next stage in my professional life, I woke up to the realization that there was a whole world of scholarship about the Holocaust and reality facing. But I felt that people in my profession were absent from doing work. It was, and still is, largely. It's not completely true now, but still largely it's in the hands of historians and people who write personal memoirs, and their shtick, their perspective is, we must remember so it won't happen again. You've heard that one. Well, have you ever heard of genocides that happened after people heard about the Holocaust and knew about the Holocaust and still did this sort of thing? So obviously that line doesn't work, but there's something to that. We should remember, owe it to my parents, to our loved ones, we should remember, but don't assume that this is good enough at preventing Holocaust. We must explain not that evil people do evil, but good people, nice people like you and me are fully capable of doing it, and that's what I explore here. So if I had to summarize what am I left with kind of things, is that I received many gifts along the way. I haven't really enumerated them. In England, there was Herta Karger, in whose household, herself was an immigrant but well-to-do, and had brought out other immigrants, and she took a number of orphan children under her wing and got them going. And so in her household, while I was in London doing stupid work in factories, she and the people that was part of her circle of people who she had brought out drummed into me, you must get more education, you must get more education, and you can do something with your life. And the model she had in front of me forever was her own husband in Germany, who way back in the 1920s, 1910s, had came from a poor family, went to work as a 13-year-old in what we call a department store. And when he was 35, he was head of the largest department store in Germany. But he had the misfortune of dying fairly young, and she then had the option of going to the opera for the rest of her life. She was able to, or doing something with her life. And that kind of outlook was drummed into me over and over again. You can do something with your life. You can do something. So she and there were a number of other persons, but particularly Hertha Krager was a major force in making me realize I could do something with my life. Another transformation for me, namely my relationship to Christians. It was Christians who saved my life. The Christian Quakers petitioned the British government to allow Jewish children to come to England, and they succeeded in allowing 10,000 children to be brought to England. So they, in a sense, were behind my being saved. But that didn't end the role of Quakers in my life. I went to a Quaker, quote, progressive school in England and a Quaker undergraduate college. During the past 60 years, my three closest friends were Christians. And one was my college roommate, Vernon Tyson. During the war, when I was in England, after I found out that my parents and the other Jews of the village who had remained had been murdered in the Sobibor extermination camp, I dropped out of Judaism for several years. I wouldn't attend any ceremonies, go to synagogue, attend it. I didn't join any congregation. I avoided Jewish people for years. Well, Vernon brought me back. Vernon brought me back to Judaism. He invited me to his church and introduced me that we are very fortunate to have this Jew visiting us today. We're honored to have him. But changed my outlook. It maybe was okay to be a Jew. So that was part of the road back. I was thinking of the gifts I got from my parents. From my father, he was a dreamer. His feet were firmly in the clouds. The German word is Luftmensch. And my mother's feet were firmly on the ground, and she saved my life by finding the Kindertransport. My father was a Luftmensch, and for me, this was a different kind of a gift in that it helped sustain me through my ups and downs. So eventually my then former wife and I went with me to Germany 40 years after I'd left. So one of the things that people mentioned to me, well, I'll read that to you before I read the poem. My mother and father and older brother were murdered in the Sobibor extermination camp. The following poem focuses on my mother. She was forever helping people. Whenever someone in our village, Jew or Christian, was in need, she came running to help. During my visit to the village 40 years later, our Christian neighbors reminded me and remembered and told me about her generosity, about my mother's generosity. Yet during the Nazi Hitler time, when our lives were increasingly endangered, none of these neighbors came to our assistance. They were conspicuously quiet. This is what the poem brings to mind. I'm no poet. I have no voice sufficient. Of the saint, my mother, answered to need by one or many, no accounting the price, abandoned by her beneficiaries to the ovens, her presence snuffed, God's eyes in tears. Mine bereft, too dry, left in Guernica.
That is always heartbreaking to hear. So I know there was a little bit of a glitch in watching the video. There was a lag, but I hope everyone got to watch it yesterday when it was posted, as well as watch it again now. And please keep posting your questions. But with that, I would like to introduce our guest speaker and thank him so much for coming in and sharing his story and what he's experienced. Dr. Fred Emil Katz. Dr. Katz, I would love to hand this over to you and have you speak to us. And then everyone, please continue to post your questions in the chat as you get them. Thank you very much, Dr. Katz. Fred, you can go ahead.
Well,
thank you.
can you get me in?
I think so. I believe you'll see. Can everyone, real quick, can everyone type me real quick? Are you seeing me or Dr. Katz?
Well, I'm in the upper corner there.
Okay, let me.
Can
I
you
see.
folks see me?
They see. Okay, you're seeing both. They're seeing both of us. So I'm gonna, let's see. I'm gonna try to.
You'll try to move me around.
Yes, they will. Let's see. Oh, here we go. There we go. Everyone should actually see Dr. Katz now.
Well, good morning. I assume we're all in the same time zone, so it's 10 o'clock, sort of. Well, first of all, thank you, Stephen, for creating this program and for the Holocaust issues and making this effort at recruiting people. And thank you, the teachers who are taking the program, for signing up for this, exposing yourself to this, and being prepared to take this in and somehow incorporate it in your work. And finally, thank you, teachers, for the work you're doing, for helping the next generation of people to lead effective lives. So I started this with a video. It's a bit of a shock treatment for you. Incidentally, the Guernica, most of you probably know what I'm talking about. In case you don't, it's the most famous painting by Picasso that deals with desecration of life during the Spanish Civil War. And in a sense, it's become a sacred statement for many people. One more word about this video. You saw it was created by a company called Gilchrist. Well, Gilchrist is a hospice organization. Well, last year I spent 5 months in their home hospice program. And after I graduated from it, and you see I'm still here. using this to demonstrate in their promotional work that the hospice is not only about the dying, but also about the living, about helping you people to live. So in a sense, this is my kind of a contribution to that effort of theirs. What I want to do is to highlight a few things from what you've seen and how I see it as being important. And so I'll talk about that for a while, and then we'll open it up for your questions and my attempts to answer. So incidentally, this is my study, and behind it is an abstract painting. I'm sort of I go for fairly abstract kind of stuff in painting. Well, first, as I think of three major themes that I want to talk about a little bit. The first thing that you saw is what I would call a survivor syndrome, which in a sense has much in common with post-traumatic stress disease that many people have, and their ways of coping with it, or ways of living with it. And the post-traumatic stress, incidentally, the common notion is, let's say, soldiers coming back from wars have to cope with a buddy of theirs dying next to them. Why wasn't it me? Kind of thing. That's more or less the popular thinking about the act of killing. And my belief is that what these people are really suffering from is not only what they saw, but what they did. They did. In a sense, ordinary wars are geared to training civilians to kill other civilians. Particularly in the First World War, where much of the killing took place in hand-to-hand combat, trench warfare, where people were in trenches on opposing sides, and you get out of your trench with your bayonet, rush to the people in the other trench and stick your knife into him before he can stick your knife into yours. But the point is, the two guys on each side, they're innocent people, basically, but who've been indoctrinated. Now is the time to do away with this other person. Well, my hunch is a good deal of post-traumatic stress disease is that issue, that what you did. You see, most people in civilian life are brought up, you're not here to kill people, life is sacred. Yet these same people go through basic training, and incidentally, what basic training is not merely about training you how to shoot a gun kind of thing. It's how to be accepting the idea, if you're told to kill that guy, you must kill him. The transformation of civilians into killing machines. During the Second World War, a famous American general, whose name escapes me, for number 2 under General Eisenhower, General Omar Bradley, gave a talk to American mothers. He was the number 2 man in the American military in the invasion of Europe. He was an amazingly honest person. He gave a talk to American mothers in which he told them, "We are converting your sons into killers." Well, I'm saying the post-traumatic stress disease for many people is the issue of what they did that went so counter, let's say, to all their upbringing as a human being in our country. So anyway, that's one part. To get about, and then the manifestation of post-traumatic stress, of what I'm calling survivor syndrome, is then having difficulty of living with yourself based on the back of things that are inside of you, that are behind. They're behind you, but not really behind you, they're within you. And so my story, in a sense, illustrates some of that, where you, in my case, left with two syndromes. One is you have to do unusually powerful things to justify your still living. You have to do unusual things. You have to continually justify that you're still living. You have to do things to do that. So in my case, it involves an academic career, writing books and writing more and more books. In my earliest book, this one here, Ordinary People and Extraordinary Evil, try to, I will get into that a little more later, what my writings are about. But the point is, I try to come up with, discover better ways of understanding the Holocaust than the mainstream scholars, namely the historians, were coming up with. But beyond that, I have felt I must do, even that isn't good enough. So in my late years, in my 80s, I tried to address the notion to do something about the fact that during the last century, we killed over 100 million of our fellow human beings in the various wars, genocides, and so on. So obviously, we're not exactly in control of human life on this planet. We're not in control. We think we are, we're not. I'm talking about the artificially created death, beyond the sort of getting sick and dying, but creating death. So where are the social sciences in this kind of thing that might help us keep from lurching to our own extinction? So anyway, in my 80s, I attempted to create a new social psychology and a new sociology. So I'm going to inflict on you one page from the prologue of one of these recent books. The book is called We Live in Social Space. And I'm going to read you one page from the foreword. Thanks to the revolution of information transmission, we live in a whirlwind of connectivity. There's seemingly no limit to who can connect with whom. Distance is no longer a word that has meaning. A place seems a quaintly irrelevant term. When we are within reach beyond the here, there seems to be no here. There's only connectivity, only fleeting, ephemeral connectedness without duration seems real. Indeed, duration is another term that has vanished from our life. Taking a step back from this picture of woe, what are we missing in our disgruntled despair? Is there a location amid our connectedness where we are where we are here, where we are? Do we have any kind of grounding? Is there, after all, something real that underlies human social living, no matter how ephemeral and fleeting are its manifestations in our daily life? Well, I suggest in this book that one conceive of social space as the base camp in which we actually live our lives, regardless of the seemingly fleeting character of our daily life. The nature and content of that social space can be discovered. The following pages describe some steps to do that. So the following pages in this book, We Live in Social Space, attempt to show different kinds of space in which we actually do exist. Now, to bring this down to earth a little bit, you've realized, we've all heard in the last year or so, an enormous increase and sudden increase in hatred of and attacks on Asian Americans. And lately, the enormous increase in open anti-Semitism in this country. Well, and again, taking one more step back from somebody who was born in Germany and is sort of familiar with the German situation in the past century. Well, in the early part of the last century, the 1900s on, Germany was the leading modern country in the world, far beyond the United States. They were the leaders of modernity in science. They had almost a monopoly on the Nobel Prizes during that period. Now, of course, all that's changed in this country. This country has had more Nobel Prize winners than others. But in modern Germany, it was Germany who was way ahead, really, of the United States and other countries in what's generally known as modernity, modern science, the respect for truth, and so on. So amid that picture of modernity, the idea of crude anti-Semitism, that was no longer a real issue in Germany. So as my father said, I'm German. Yes, he was German, which meant there's no, anti-Semitism, that's in Poland, where they still play those old games in Germany. Yet it was precisely in Germany that you have this eruption of the most extreme form of murderous anti-Semitism in the history of the world. In Germany, this modern country, there it happened. So behind all this, the sociologist in me is saying, that one of the facts of our lives as social creatures is there is such a thing as hidden space, where we plant the things that are currently unmentionable, unfashionable, beyond the pale, but they're part of our history, part of our nature. And since they're hidden, they're not subject to public control. So they can grow in unthinkable ways and still be real, still be unknown, and occasionally be available for activation. See, going back to our time, the Asian Americans, well, shortly after Japan entered the Second World War against the United States, all of a sudden, Asian Americans who were born here, who were long-time residents, were suddenly interned and treated as enemies without the public cry, you're mistreating Americans. Suddenly this unearthed the hidden stuff about Asians. So of course, Jews nowadays, if they have any memory, can think of that. But for me as a sociologist, this is one of the realities of life that we have to take into account. And this is one of the things I'm talking about, say, in this fairly recent book that I wrote in my 80s. So coming back, the survivor syndrome then includes, in my case, that you have to do unusual things, in this case, contribute to understanding the Holocaust as beyond what his traditional views are of among Holocaust scholars. The terrible people were here at work doing terrible things. Well, my teaching about the Holocaust is, yes, there were horrible things that were being done, that had been done, but the real issue is not that monsters were doing monstrous things, but decent people, ordinary people, our neighbors, people like you and me, could be transformed into becoming participants in a big way in the most monstrous activities. This transformation of decent, ordinary human beings is at the base of my main teaching about the Holocaust in this book, Ordinary. I guess it comes, no matter how I hold it, it comes through as in unreadable form. Anyway, it says ordinary people and extraordinary evil.
We're able to see it good. We can see it the right way.
Okay.
Perfect, Dr.
But
Katz.
maybe it's upside down.
I understand.
So anyway, this came out in '93. And is still not mainstream stuff, but it's the burden of that book is to demonstrate how people can be transformed, decent people, good people can be transformed into participants by showing how it ties in with some very traditional sociological research on people's work in factories and doing stupid work in factories and still being able to live with themselves. Some of that work of the 1920s sociology I applied to the guards at Auschwitz and so on. And so it is wrestling with this common humanity and the flexibility of it and understanding that is the burden of that book. Now, unfortunately, the price of this book is crazy, $68. I don't expect you to go out and buy the damn book, but maybe you can get some of your schools to buy it or get it. But that's the burden of that book. The history then, the fate of that book, a famous Harvard professor, after reading it, tried to get me appointed to the Harvard faculty, but he was no longer chairman of his department, and the person who was chairman vetoed it and my appointment. And at that time, I was unemployed. My marriage had broken up and I was on welfare. So due to the ups and downs, and again of my survivors, part of the survivor syndrome is not only that you have to do unusual things, but also doing self-destructive things. You heard me mention that I twice walked away from a lifetime tenured professorship. Crazy. Self-destructive stuff. That is also part of this, my survivor syndrome. And I suspect it's not that unusual, but I'm just giving you a dose of my private version of doing really crazy things to undermine, not being able to learn Hebrew when I was surely expected to be teaching in Hebrew in a Hebrew country. But then walking away, but also never feeling rooted anywhere. I had moved 32 times when I stopped counting how many times I was moving. 32 times. Now think of what this does to family life, to children and everybody who is involved in the screw up of life, that you never feel you belong here. So these are part of the survivor syndrome, among other syndromes that you've surely known about, this high rates of alcoholism and suicide as a part of a survivor syndrome. Among Holocaust survivors, I have a list in one of my books of 5 famous Holocaust survivors who became famous writers. Primo Levi was the most famous, but there are others, 5 of them, who once wrote really outstanding books. Some of their work was about the Holocaust, but some of them, in terms of Primo Levi, was about celebration of life. Yet Primo Levi and all of these 5 committed suicide. These same guys who partly embraced life and couldn't live life. So that's part of the survival syndrome that is a real fact of life. And I think not terribly different from soldiers who suffer from post-traumatic stress. The most common features among them, of course, is alcoholism and not being able to hold a job and things like that. So anyway, you got a dose of my version of survivor syndrome, and I appreciate you sort of getting a sense of that reality. Well, anyway, another type of issue then that I wanted to mention as a theme is that a sociologist's approach to the Holocaust. So the theme of the starting point there is, don't be satisfied with the notion that monsters do monstrous things. It's that decent people can do monstrous things. Then our burden as scholars, as scientists, as human beings, is to try to understand that process, that the transformation of decent people into murderous individuals who do it with glee. And that, I think, is the burden of this Ordinary People, an Extraordinary Evil book, as best I can demonstrate it. And so it is outside the mainstream of readings you find about the Holocaust. But I think it's an issue one must confront, especially now that is in the American political scene, where we find such turmoil of recruiting people into causes that many of us don't understand at all. But in the case of the Holocaust, I think I offer sort of a case study of how it worked in that case. And so I appreciate your interest in this as teachers, as human beings, and being in the business of transforming people or getting people to grow their humanity. But that's the burden of that book. And the other part of a sociology of the Holocaust, as I see it, is this issue of hidden space that I talk about in the book, We Live in Social Space, that I read to you from, that we don't quite understand it, except when those of you who are anthropologically inclined, those of you who study cultures, or the idea that human societies are held together by common culture, common beliefs and practices and customs, that underneath them can be public, what is currently manifested and practiced, underneath there can be other stuff that's put away in storage, but only occasionally erupting. But also literature is sometimes a way of unearthing things that are beneath the surface, that are part of the culture, but that there is such a thing as hidden space. Incidentally, that book has other forms of space that I'm peddling. In addition to hidden space, the other forms of space are closed space. That is, in a sense, we are held together by a sense of common morality, things, our values and beliefs. But there is such a thing where we believe that anybody, people who are outside that common sense, they're totally different from us. So anyway, I work on this in relation to the famous Milgram experiment that most of you will have heard of, the electric shock experiments, where Stanley Milgram was a young social psychologist at Yale, late 1940s, 50s or so, thereabout, conducting an experiment with really following the Holocaust, he being Jewish, and the issue for him was that surely Americans wouldn't behave like Germans, of just following orders, was the thing you heard about so often, just following orders. Surely Americans wouldn't behave like that. So he established these famous electric shock experiments at Yale University, where people were told to inflict electric shock on innocent people. In reality, this was a sham. They weren't really doing it. But the people who took part in the experiment didn't know that. They thought they were told to shock people into becoming more effective learners. And so the whole thing was set up to show that surely Americans were not like Germans into just following orders when a crazy leader told them to do crazy things. But lo and behold, to everybody's surprise, the Americans behaved like Germans. They were, under these conditions, they were willing to inflict electric shock on innocent people. And so the Milgram's explanation was really a big surprise, and that it didn't hold water in a sense, but it was a fact of life that Americans were willing, under certain conditions, to inflict pain on innocent people. That was the famous Milgram experiment. Well, my explanation and my re-explanation of that is that Milgram created a closed moral world in the lab where people left behind their own values, that you don't hurt innocent people. That was outside. So the idea of closed, another kind of social space, is that they're closed moral worlds within which things can happen that can be totally different from outside that moral world. So anyway, I don't want to go into, but that's another one. And then I don't want to go into this any further, except to wind up on this part and just to go into the final piece that I want to emphasize, namely my relation to Christians. As I mentioned in the video, I started in total fear of Christians, and all Christians were fearful people. In my village, certainly people used to be our neighbors. No one behaved in a neighborly way. That I was terrified of Christians, all Christians. And yet, as I mentioned, Christians became central to my getting alive together. So both as Christian Quakers getting the kinder transport started, and then my three Christian friends. Incidentally, Vernon Tyson, whom I mentioned, was on his way to being a Methodist minister. He was going to be a minister. His father was a minister, a Methodist minister. His grandfather was a Methodist minister. And he was going to be a minister, and he did become a Methodist minister. First as a country preacher like his father, and then a Methodist minister of a huge urban ministry in Raleigh, North Carolina, when he retired. But he was a lifelong friend, and we shared many moments together. The other two Christians were in graduate school. A person who was a couple of years ahead of me was one of those Christian friends who gave me my first job. Over the years, we were in contact with each other. He became a professor in the medical school at the University of Texas. And after he retired, he moved to South Texas to be near his children. His wife had died. So one day I get a phone call from his daughter saying the end was near, that his end was near, and he needs to hear from you. He needs to hear from you. And so I got on the phone to him, and it turned out he wanted me to assure him that he had done life important work. that he had done important work. He wanted this assurance from me as his friend. I tried as best I could to do that, to say he had taught generations of medical students that that patients weren't just a bunch of symptoms, they were social creatures with families and social ties and communities as a sociologist. So anyway, that was left with him. That, I hope it did some good. And the other one, Clyde, was a man named Clyde Wilson. We started out as academic teachers at Texas Tech and at the same time. And so we spent much time together from then on over many years. So when, after Clyde died, I get a phone call from him. He remained in Missouri, and he had a very unusual career, actually. He was chairman of his department. He was mayor of his city. He had 5 children, all of whom are relatively normal. He had a wife with a big time career. So anyway, after he died, his wife called me to tell him that he died and that there would be a memorial service. And I said, I want to be there. She said, you must be there. You must be there. So I'm saying I have the transforming experience. People you were desperately afraid of could also be divine human beings in the sense that we all are. So anyway, with these words, I'm now giving it over to you and your questions.
Dr. Katz, I think you hit that mute button one more time. That unmute. There we go. All right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read some of the questions off that we've got here. We've got a number of questions for you, and we will take our time in answering them as long as Dr. Katz is willing to talk with us. So I'm excited. So one of our first questions here is from Kristen Bryant. She says, you spoke about the phrase that we must remember so it doesn't happen again, yet genocide continues to happen. Young students are sometimes quick to pick up on this reality. And what response would you give to them when they try to comment or question that genocide continues to happen despite knowing about events like the Holocaust?
Well, a good deal of my career is based on refuting the idea that memory alone is a panacea, that we don't really understand how it can be happening. We don't have decent social science to help us understand how this can happen. Mainly, for instance, my particular thing of how that ordinary people can be doing it is one answer. Ordinary, decent people, it doesn't require monsters. It requires ordinary people's participation and involvement at various levels. Is one of the reasons why, to understand that it is ordinary people who can be mobilized, and that is a frontier for science that needs to be worked on.
Hopefully that answers one of your questions. But so I've got another question here it's kind of similar, talking about it, that happened again. You know, right now when we teach history classes, we teach the Holocaust, you know, and even as individuals, as we hear parents who are talking to their students, and students feel they are helpless and overwhelmed, and teachers do feel that way as well, because they're locked into teaching a certain way and to their students. So how do you teach? How do you find actionable steps to recommend how to, you know, teach the Holocaust differently, how to get people to understand, even act out in society? Are there any actionable steps, or are we not there yet?
Let me see whether I understand the question. That it's very frustrating to try and teach it. Is there other action, other practical steps we can take?
Yes. Yes.
Well, I think by teaching how the ones that did happen, again, coming back to my theme, that it takes the transformation of decent human beings, and this can be at the forefront of education. How is it that we can actually so influence people to do things that are pretty destructive to other people? Well, one thing to backtrack, getting a little bit back to the Milgram story, to recognize that we sometimes live in a closed moral world that thinks other moral worlds don't have a legitimate right to exist. That can be clarified, whether say Christian versus Muslim or Jew versus Palestinian, let's say nowadays, to be able to open up to that other folks, let's say in terms of coming home to me now, between Israelis and Palestinians, that Israel's viability must not rest on the notion that the Palestinians don't have a viable right to exist. That we recognize this kind of a crazy dichotomy, that there are other viable systems of belief and history that must be understood. I don't know whether that's a good enough answer, but that our notion of closed moral worlds is one way of getting at that our moral system can be so closed that we assume others don't have a right to exist. That doesn't mean that they're all equal, but they're all viable in their own way, but they're not equal. I don't have to accept the Stalinist communism to understand that under communism, under Stalinism, people found a viable life that may be different from mine. In one of my books, I have a story about an American traveler who traveled in the old Soviet Union. They seemed so backward, but yet they're talking to people out in the hinterland in Russia. They found the people yearning for the good old days under Stalin, where you could get cheap sausage. Sausage was dirt cheap. You can get real sausage cheap. That was something that was really important to them. And they had food, and it was available under that system that gave them a viability. See, in other words, the idea that the different moral systems can exist and really have a hold on people, that doesn't mean that these others are disgraceful people.
That's amazing insight. And one thing, Ms. Patel asked a follow-up in that question. We were just talking, I was looking in the chat, and she said, in the state of Florida next year, or within the next few years, we're going to have these educational benchmarks built around character development. Do you think that is a step that would help in schools to be teaching students about character development, how to accept people, how to understand people from a young age?
Yes, I definitely think so. That what you're calling character development is so the same theme as understanding belief systems that may be different from yours. You don't have to accept them, but you do need to realize they have real viability and sustenance for people that are very real. You don't have to accept them, but they're worthy, not necessarily opponents, but worthy ways of living. It's sort of a thin line between saying, recognizing other systems are viable to saying they're better than mine or worse than mine, that you can live with others being different, but that does not give you the right to ignore them and their power.
Definitely. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Let's go to a question from Miss Nancy Lee Thompson. What, when, or where did you sing your first song after those 30 years?
I'm glad you asked that one. So during the 30 years, whenever it was time to sing, I said, I don't know how to sing. This was not a conscious thing. I don't know how to sing. Well, while I was a bachelor, I used to be invited to the home of friends for Passover Seder. And as those of you know who have been to Passover Seders, toward the end, there are lots of songs. They're really children's songs. Who knows one? I know one, and they're children's songs, and they're endless often. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. Anyway, there are lots of songs. And toward the end of these. So anyway, when I was married, the first time I gave a Seder, I suddenly sang these songs. I suddenly, and I've loved them. I love them ever since. And as I said, they're endless. My partner almost invariably reaches the point where it says, enough already, because they're endless. Anyway, it came back to me when I taught my first Passover Seder. But thank you for the question.
That was a great question, Nancy Lee. Okay, Miss Adriana Perez would like to ask, as a Holocaust survivor, what is your take on today's political turmoil, specifically in the United States?
I didn't understand the question.
I'm sorry. What is your take? What is your view on the political turmoil that has occurred within the United States recently?
Well, I thought I was already alluding to that a little bit. First of all, as a Jew, there's the frightening emergence of anti-Semitism that reminded me of Germany. And that the Jews are not really waking up to that yet, but the similarity, both in terms of a leader who is essentially doing some of the things that Hitler did or would like to do some of the things, so an extreme authoritarian and totalitarian government. It's scary as hell. That's my view. To ask, well, how does one answer it? I think so the short answer is it is very scary, is my view. As a social scientist, that's pretty impotent thinking. And I think mobilizing part of the positive things that are going on is that there is much more of a realization now of the potential poison of this system than there was in Germany. There's much less of innocence about that than it was in the Hitler regime, but the similarity, of course, is very striking. But I do believe we can get through it.
Wonderful. Do you have time for a few more questions? I don't want to push over in your time.
Yes.
And everyone else, I hope we're slated to end, but I'd rather continue on and finish some of these remaining questions with Dr. Katz while I have it on here, and we'll just record a session later if that sounds okay with everybody. And I'll just, so one of the questions also, did you ever reunite with your sister who was sent to Dayton to live with relatives?
Did I what?
Reunite with your sister.
Yes. I mean, she came to America in 1937, and I came to America in 1949. She was married and had children, and she's now no longer living, but her son, nephew, is a close friend and relative. I think her life was not the happiest life. She came to a very nurturing family in Dayton, Ohio. But she was a kid of 13 who didn't know a word of English, being thrown into this. And I was never very close to her situation, partly because she married very young and lived in a very constrained marriage that where I had not as much access I would have wished. But yes, I was reunited with her, but we didn't. Actually, the reuniting the family in Dayton when I came, and where my sister was no longer living with that family. When I first arrived in America, I didn't have enough money to travel to Dayton. But I did have Mrs. Carger and my cousin had arranged for a room for me in New York. I stayed there and worked in. My first job was as an elevator operator. So after I saved enough money to travel to Dayton, I was embraced by my aunt and my sister, my mother's sister, who was the first person who hugged me in 8 years.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And she wept and I wept. But my sister was no longer living there. She was married and out of the house. But anyway, that family was very nurturing to me. They sponsored me coming to America, that my aunt and uncle and family.
That's amazing. That is amazing. It sounds very bittersweet.
Yes, but their son, I mentioned people along the way, Mrs. Cargo, who lifted me up. Well, they had a son who was almost the same age, the Dayton family as I was, and he encouraged me to go to college. And I remember him saying, "They'll be lucky to get you." So anyway, he was one of theirs who lived at me, their son.
That's amazing. Oh,
They're
wow.
lucky to get you.
They were. They were. So I've got another question from Ms. Fanny Cernick. Dr. Katz, thank you for sharing your story with us. Are there any parts of what you've experienced during the war, something you don't talk about?
You want me to talk about what I won't talk about?
Yes, that's what you're asking. Wait.
Well, during the war, I was in England during the second, as those of you who are up on history, the Blitz, the attacks on London, took place in two phases. The first were the bombing of London. And during the first phase, I was still in the school, in the boarding school in Kent. But during the second phase, I was in London, and I worked in a factory. And it's not, I mean, I haven't talked about it here, but I have talked about it elsewhere. I have a cute story. The Germans sent over what they call pilotless planes that were laden with explosives. So they flew over and then dropped and exploded. It was the V1. The V2 were then rockets of the more traditional. They were all designed by Werner von Braun, incidentally, the guy who helped the American effort later. Anyway, I was the pilotless planes. They flew fairly low, and you heard the motor. When the motor stopped, they dropped to the ground and exploded. So when the motor stopped, you had 10 seconds to try and find a way of saving yourself. So I lived with this huge landlady, Mrs. Blitz. So one day we were sitting in the kitchen, and we heard one of these planes came over, and suddenly the story, the heading is how I collided with my landlady in midair, trying to see how I collided with my 200-pound landlady in midair, trying to save our life. So what happened was, we were sitting in the kitchen, and we heard this plane, suddenly it stopped. So both of us tried to dive under the same table at the same time. We collided in midair because she was almost twice as heavy as I was. So anyway, that's one of my wartime stories.
I don't think I've ever heard that. That's
How I collided with my 200-pound landlady in midair trying to save our lives.
wonderful.
But thank you, folks, for listening.
No, that was great.
And thank you for you.
Do you have time for another question? Oh, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. I mean, I think everybody in our chat has the little chat box on the side has just blown up with this. That is how grateful they are that you were speaking. This has been the highlight of my week, and just getting to speak with you and talk to you over the past year and planning this has been one of the highlights of my life, and I really appreciate it. So like maybe I'll do a closing kind of question, just real quick. So what are some lessons that you would say are important that you learned as a child that you might pass on to today's youth in handling adversity and hardship? And this is from Tyler White.
Well, to learn to listen is not what people say at first isn't necessarily the last chapter in what you need to hear from that person. In a sense, what I've been learning myself recently in the retirement community, where we are confronted with the reality that people die, that each person has left us with a gift that is worth something. But in relation to the Holocaust, I think we must be willing to learn differently than we have done in the past. Not just to reiterate that horrible people do horrible things, but rather the message, how can ordinary people be transformed, be so transformed as to do horrible things? That must be part of our mindset as we try to approach getting a handle on this. So it's not only good people who automatically do good things. We must be willing to learn that our society can transform us, and how this transformation can work is important. Of course, you are in the transformation business as teachers of transforming people. And so in a sense, I'm teaching people who know better than I that you're in the transformation business. But the transformation business can involve values and way moralities. We need moralities to hold us together, but these are not foolproof, and they can change, and we can be instruments of that change, as you know, that you are in business of doing it. So thank you for listening to somebody like me. Thank you. Thank you.
We thank you. Thank you so much for, everyone. We got everyone. I'm giving, we've got a lot of people doing applause. Thank you so much for all of the time. This was
for having me, Stephen. Thank you. And all of you, thank you for
a pleasure. I will be reaching back out if that's okay. Thank you again. Thank you profusely for all the teachers who are here, to everyone that you speak to. It's just been an honor and a privilege to be able to speak with you and to hear everything that you've had to say. And actually reading your book, I'm really trying to encourage all the teachers to use your book in tandem with how they teach the Holocaust.
As I was saying, the Ordinary People book, $68 is obscene.
We found it on Amazon cheaper. I found it on Amazon a little bit cheaper. So I think if they have to buy it.
But the other books, that's what I'm trying to do now, and for which I need converts badly.
Well, I think you might earn them here. So we have to get some people who really are very interested in a lot of your writings. And it's just been amazing to hear from you, and hopefully we'll find more effective ways to teach about the Holocaust, incorporating sociology and other behavioral sciences and make it effective and keep working.
That's a compliment. Thank you very, very, very much. And thank you for attending.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Everybody, I will be, I want to say goodbye to Dr. Katz and let him go, and I will be ending, and I will start the next session just for us to have a discussion briefly afterwards. Dr. Katz, thank you so much for your time and everything. Take care of yourself, and I will be reaching out to you soon.
Thank you. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.